asking the question, we have smart answers. We're both looking at the same thing, and yet we're seeing things differently. You see a picture of a robot. I see two people. There was a fellow by the name of Father Joe Martin who used that little technique when he talked about how two people can be looking at exactly the same thing and yet see something entirely different. Now we see that in our culture all of the time. We certainly see that in our political culture. I hear it all of the time. Some people look at the current occupant of the White House and they see this great individual who was coming to Washington to clean house because he wasn't a politician, to take on that sort of political culture that had entrenched itself there. But others, looking at exactly the same occupant, see something very different. That's the way it is in our culture, and it's the way it is with the texts for today. We hear these. We see the words, but we may actually, in fact, be seeing something very different. Isaiah is writing to a group of people who have been just returned to Jerusalem from captivity. Now last week I shared with you how about, there are certain events which take place that change the destiny for millions of people, can in fact change the landscape forever. In the 8th century BC, the landscape of Israel was changed forever. The Assyrians would swoop in, they would destroy Israel, and the 10 tribes that lived there were dispersed, never to be heard from again. They were simply lost. And about 2 centuries later, the same thing would happen to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. The Babylonians would come in, and they would kill most of the people. They would take the younger ones and the women, and they brought them back to Babylon, where they were captives. And the Babylonians took over. They destroyed the temple. They lived in their houses. And now Isaiah is prophesying to these same people who have just now returned. I had a clergy friend when I was in Arizona. And it was one of those that when we got together for lunch, it never went well. Because we both had a bit of a problem with the church body that we were a part of. And so we would kind of get into gossiping. Now, he was a pastor who had started a mission church in the 1960s. He'd been a part of building this church out to over 3,000 members. He was at one time worshiping about 1,300 a week. But all of a sudden, like most other churches, the attendance started to drop. And so he would lament to me about that. And then he would immediately shift into, I wish it was the 60s again, when people went to church. This desire for some sort of better time. When people went to church, if you wanted to grow the church, you just put up a building. People would come. Now, I didn't have the heart to tell my friend that my worship attendance was actually increasing. I just kept that to myself. But there is that same dynamic happening in the people to whom Isaiah is writing. See, they remember that golden time when the temple was beautiful, magnificent, when Solomon sat upon that throne. Solomon, a man of immense wisdom. And though they had rebuilt the temple, it just wasn't the same. It wasn't as glorious. It wasn't as magnificent. And the same with their houses. They had left their houses. And the Babylonians had moved in. And now they were back. But their houses were not the same. They had a hard time literally getting rid of the stench of the Babylonians. And so the people are caught up in this desire to want that better time. Longing for those old days when the world was right. Barbara Brown Taylor, a marvelous theologian, writes how all of us want, desire that time. She says, we want that time when nothing is hid or needs to be hidden. A time when there are no scrapes or dents or bruises or scars. A time when everything is whole and we're all holy. And so we pick some place, some time, some mythological thing. And then we say to ourselves, if we could just get back. But instead, the vision that Isaiah holds up is not about some glory time in the past. And here's oftentimes where we may see the text, but hear very differently. I once had this conversation in a very public way. When it talked about Christ's return, which is what the season of Advent is focused on, is Christ's return. And they were of this idea that somehow that was going to be a time of horrible tragedy and violence and wars. But that's not the image that Isaiah paints. It's not the image that our gospel text paints. The image that Isaiah is painting is not about some past glory day, but about God's future that is breaking in upon us. About a new day which is breaking in upon us. A day where there will be no pain, no crying, no worrying. A time when there will be no dents or scars. Now we as Lutherans have been holding up this image for 500 years. When we say the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Luther Luther says in his explanation, he said, we are not praying for God's kingdom to come because it comes even without our praying. God's kingdom is breaking in upon us whether we like it or not. And as the gospel writer tells us today, we have to lift our heads up, not down. Look out, not in. It's hard to do. It's very easy to look at our world and see everything that's wrong. It's more difficult to see where God's kingdom is breaking in upon us. Now, we only participate in this kingdom. We don't control it. We can't make it happen. There's no law we can pass that will suddenly usher the kingdom of God in. God's kingdom is dependent upon God's time, not our time. His way, not our way. But the kingdom is breaking in upon us. Even as we sit here, God's kingdom is breaking in upon us. As we turn our focus to Matthew, we will see this in much more detail, because Matthew's whole gospel is about how the kingdom is breaking in upon us. We are not breaking in upon the kingdom. There's nothing I can do to make this kingdom happen. But what I can do is lift my head up and out. I can see those places where God's kingdom is, in fact, breaking in upon us in this very moment. And that's the image that Isaiah holds up. The very image captured by that marvelous theologian. That time is coming. It is breaking in upon us when there will be nothing to hide or hide from. There will be no scars or dents or scrapes. That time is breaking in upon us when we will be whole and holy before God. Larry made a great point the other night. We look at events, and those events and how they impact. And last week I was talking about how those impacts were negative. But there is one event which trumps them all, one event which broke in upon us in Bethlehem that will forever change the world. And so while we live in this messiness, Isaiah challenges us to hold up that image of God's kingdom as it breaks in upon us. That marvelous kingdom where we are made whole.